Colin, thank you for being prepared to answer some questions. And really the first one is, and rightly so, as you look back over the General Assembly, I want to ask about encouragements that were there, because it's so easy to focus in the negativity and things that are not working. But what kind of encouragements would you want to share with us from the recent General Assembly?
Well, first of all, it's nice to be here. I'm sorry I'm welcoming you here a few hours late, but it was my wife's birthday yesterday, and we were away to celebrate my birthday, which was 6 months ago, but that's the way things work out in our family. I've been at every assembly since 2009, either as a corresponding member or as a commissioner every 4 years. And I've sat through almost every debate during the last 5 General Assemblies. I want to say that I think this last assembly was probably the most encouraging by far of the assemblies I've been at since 2009. As my wife said, who sat through every part of the assembly as well up in the visitors gallery, there was more spoken about Jesus and about prayer and about mission than I can remember in any of the assemblies that I've attended over the last 20 or 30 years. Of course, everyone's impression of the assembly is personal, but my reflection of the assembly was positive, that there was a realistic assessment that there was work to be done and a desire to do that work together. In my own role as convener of mission and discipleship, we've seen a lot of encouragements in the last 2 years and find ourselves now strategically placed when the church is aware that the great challenge we face is the shortage of ministers of word and sacrament, the projection being that we could be 200 ministers short in the next 10 years, and a desire to see what God is saying in that, and as part of that, trying to see whether the church is needing to try and discover other ways of doing ministry through empowering the eldership and other people to carry out some of the tasks that were previously, it's the minister's job. Now, in my role in mission and discipleship, I was delighted at the assembly to be able to say we are beginning to provide the tools that churches need in order to undertake the work of the kingdom in our country. And I want to say to you that if you've got a website, please put a link on your website to www.resourcingmission.org.uk, because there is a whole range of resources that will equip you both in the discipleship of your people and the outreach into your parish and beyond. We've been well served this last year by the Statistics for Mission Group that give us a more complete understanding of every parish in Scotland than has previously been available. And with resources like Future Focus, there is now no excuse for a congregation not understanding who their neighbours are, or discovering what would be good news for them. And I think that's enormously encouraging. The Assembly passed a report which encouraged us to reach out to those who were of other faith positions in our country in a way that has not been passed previously. The last time such a report was brought, it ended up in division and dissension. That wasn't the case. I found that encouraging. The church's openness to exploring what a fresh expression of church would be, and wanting to deal with any laws that prevented that going forward, as well as training up people through the Mission Shape Ministry course, was a tremendous endorsement of finding new and creative ways of reaching out to our country of Scotland. And that's only in terms a little bit of our report, but again and again people were recognizing the importance of turning to God and looking beyond our walls in reaching out to the people of Scotland with the gospel that transforms lives and brings hope.
Thank you, Colin. Of course, Wednesday was the day when the overture was discussed, and that is of huge significance because we know many churches that are struggling with that, and people who have left the Church of Scotland. And that debate took up a large part of the Wednesday of General Assembly, relating to an accommodation of those who are in a same-sex partnership having ministry of our Church of Scotland. I'm going to ask you at this stage, Colin, there's sort of three areas of question. One, just your own reflection on that day's debate. I think secondly, because some of us will know and understand when talk of Barrier Act is made, but I think it's helpful just to be reminded what the Barrier Act is regarding this decision. And I guess thirdly, really, what do you think the Church's position will be in 10 months' time? And that's the 2015 General Assembly. So going back, first of all, to my initial question, your reflections on the debate that took place about the overture.
You may remember back in 2013 that two alternative positions were presented before the Assembly, the traditional and the reactionary, and that suddenly in the midst of that debate, from Albert Bogle and Alan Hamilton, a compromise motion was presented and passed, which has met with considerable reaction, depending how you feel that was. And during the last year, of course, we've seen the pain of seeing friends, ministers and members and elders feel that that was a step too far and to have left our denomination. So this debate has obviously brought a lot of pain to many people because of the consequences of it, both the issue and the implications. In terms of the actual debate, it was in two parts, and I hope if you weren't there, you listened into both parts, because the groundwork was established in the morning by the report of the Theological Forum, who had been tasked with this question: is it possible for a church to exist as a mixed economy? And the reflections that came from the convener, Ian Torrance, were that this issue, which has so divided the church, the Theological Forum believed ultimately it was not an issue on the authority of Scripture, but an issue on the interpretation of Scripture. I made an interesting comment that, and evangelicals for 40 years have realized how complex scriptural interpretation is since Tony Thistleton's groundbreaking work back in the 1970s. And he said that whenever anyone looks at Scripture, they either look at it analogically, in other words, while the issue we're addressing isn't addressed directly, there is this principle which makes us believe that there is this application in our contemporary world. And we all use Scripture interpretation analogically to some extent. And then he said we also look for verses in Scripture that seem to address the issue directly and apply them to our contemporary context, and we all do that. And then he tried to say, what do we do in a situation where people within the church feel very strongly that that their view is the scriptural view and the other view is not a scriptural view? How do we live with constrained diversity? And he said, well, we don't say that both views are the same. Of course we don't. That would be nonsense. But what we have to say is within that difference of view, that passionately held difference of view, that passionately held scriptural understanding difference of view, are there things deeper that can hold us together? And he went back to look at, for example, John Calvin's advice to those of the Reformed tradition who were in churches where Luther's understanding of the sacraments pertained, and whether it was right for them to take bread and wine when they didn't agree with Luther's theology of communion. And Calvin said, we argue our case, but we believe that behind the case is a deeper unity that holds us together. And then he cited Augustine, and he cited illustrations within our own Church of Scotland tradition. Now, at the end of that report, the Assembly accepted his report. There was no robust challenge to it. So the principle of saying, we disagree passionately, but we believe there's a unity that holds us together, that was accepted and was the premise into which we went into the debate in the afternoon. Alan Hamilton tried to present the overture, accepting that there were loose ends, questions, and all the rest. And Jerry Middleton spoke on behalf of the traditional position. I would have to say that I don't think evangelicals have spoken better than they spoke at the Assembly this year. I think Jerry spoke better than I've heard Jerry speak this year. He was less wordy, he was clearer, he was passionate, he was courteous. And the evangelicals who supported his position also spoke consistently well. And the moderator gave a real hearing and time for people to hear the overture, and those who were of a reactionary position who wanted to soften the overture and make it less of an exception and less hoops to go through to allow people in a civil partnership to be considered for the ministry. That position was rejected by the Assembly, and so after a long hearing was Jerry's position. And the Assembly in the end, by a proportion of about 2-1, supported the overture. Now, obviously, people responded to that differently. The issue of a compromise is that no one likes a compromise because it's not their position on both sides. The question is, how do we live from then on in? So that was the debate. What happens now is that the overture, as approved by the General Assembly, has to go to every presbytery in Scotland over the next 8 months. Every presbytery has one vote, whether they have 400 members or 8 members. If the presbyteries by a majority support the overture, then the normal practice is it would come back to the Assembly next year and almost go through on the nod. If a majority of presbyteries reject the overture, then the overture falls, and that's just reported at the General Assembly. If you've read the Forward Together site, they would feel very strongly that the overture should be resisted and would hope that the Barrier Act process, which is meant to check that we don't do radical things on one day's debate at a General Assembly, will fall. If it falls, it's not clear exactly what position we then go back to at that point. But each person obviously must make up their own mind. We gather it will be a secret ballot in every presbytery, so people can vote according to their conscience without fear of what anyone else thinks or without any pressure from anyone else. And that will be taken round presbyteries over the next 6 months. So that's where we are with the debate. And so by next year at the General Assembly, either we'll be back to square one because the whole thing will have fallen under the Barrier Act, or if it's been upheld, then the position is that the historic position of the Church, which is what the overture says, has been affirmed, namely that a minister ought to be someone either single and celibate or someone in a heterosexual marriage relationship. But the overture continues that if a congregation wishes to exercise liberty of opinion on this issue, then after 2 significant votes by the Kirk Session at a period separated by some weeks, they vote that they would like to exercise that liberty of opinion, then the Kirk Session in that church will give to the nominating committee, which is not the Kirk Session, the power to consider among the applicants for a vacancy, and it only happens at that point that they will give in the vacancy powers to the nominating to consider someone who is in a civil partnership among other candidates. Not saying that the nominating has to choose that person, him or her. They have still to choose the best person for their congregation, but that is what the exception allows. So that's what the overture is saying. And if you've been following Facebook or other blogs, you'll know that evangelicals feel quite differently about that issue. The issue that it does mean is, if it is passed, is that every time a church comes into vacancy, the Kirk Session have to make that decision once their minister is gone, whether they will consider or not consider among the list of candidates those who are in a civil partnership. Is that? I hope I've got that right. I think that's a fair description of what was said.
And you can maybe speak to Colin later if you want any of that clarified. It's maybe quite important for myself to say at this point, actually, that COSN is not theologically lightweight in any way at all, but it is Church of Scotland Evangelical. It's a network. And therefore, we do not kind of dictate to people in terms of how they should respond to issues and how they should respond to the overture in presbytery. We invite, if you've got a vote in presbytery, to think biblically and theologically about the issue and prayerfully and vote appropriately. That's the way COSN works. It's also important, if you feel very strongly that you have the opportunity in presbytery to and you feel it's right, and you're convinced before God that that is the case, to oppose the overture, to do that. And Richard, you are on Forward Together's, the board, aren't you? And I'm right in saying that Forward Together are preparing material that would be helpful for this discussion in presbyteries.
And also, the full text of Jerry's very helpful presentation is also on the Forward Together site. If people want to take time to look at both his presentation and then his summing up response, it's all laid out there and is well worth a careful and prayerful read about that.
So Richard, can you just stand so that people can identify you? If they want to get hold of you at the end, that's Richard, okay. If you want further information, how to be helped in presbytery, if you feel this overture needs to be opposed. One last question. One last question.
And I've got one last answer, so it doesn't matter what your question is. I know what the answer is I'm going to say. So.
Okay, I come up to you, Colin, and I better stay with my microphone, so I can't come up to you, but I say I'm just absolutely fed up with the Church of Scotland. It's all this stuff about, well, we've had it for years now, and it's off the map, Bible, all the rest of it. I think it's time for me to leave. Can you give me one argument why I should stay in the Church of Scotland?
I can give you a number of different arguments. I remember my own minister, George Phillip, talking way back in the 1950s about how exactly the same question was asked of him and a much smaller group of evangelicals, that they should leave the Church of Scotland because it had lost its soul then. His answer then, if I can paraphrase, was basically, when God leaves the Church of Scotland, I'll know it's time for me to leave, but not until and not till then. I have to say, and you need to know this, that there are more evangelicals in senior positions in the councils and committees of the Church of Scotland than there have ever been. I need you to know also that, as well as being convener of mission discipleship, I sit on the Council of Assembly, which is the overarching group, where there are quite a number of evangelicals. I have never felt any pressure not to be an evangelical. I've never felt any pressure to mute down the distinctives that I feel as an evangelical, and I've never felt any resistance to any of the work we have tried to promote in my own area, mission and discipleship, because I'm an evangelical. Jim has just stepped down from nominations committee. I was convener before that. Ken Stott's now the convener, and Jim and I could both testify that never has a person been rejected by the nominations committee because of their theology. They've been rejected because perhaps they're not reliable. They've been rejected because they are difficult, but they have never been rejected for theological reasons. That's never come up. Is that fair to say, Jim? Not once. I was a member for 3 years. I was convener for 3 years. Jim's been convener for 3 years. The sadness has been, and when I first came on to mission and discipleship, not a single evangelical had asked to come on to the mission and discipleship committee before I became convener. That was a huge sadness. If any group should be an area where evangelicals should be, and the situation has turned round there, but the sadness has been that you cannot pick people who aren't willing to be nominated. And just as a last thing to encourage you, well, why am I encouraged? Well, my son is at assessment conference today. I'm encouraged because he believes it's right to put his name forward to be considered whether the church would happen to be a minister. Now, I don't know how that will go. But I would be speaking him out of that if I didn't feel that I believed that if he felt that God has called him into that role, that that's the way forward. So I think there are lots of reasons still to be encouraged. I think there are open doors just now. Last sentence, if the Church Without Walls gave us permission to change back in 2001, I felt this year at the Assembly was saying, we've just got to change. And that door is open where there are people, men and women of integrity, who will play their part in the unseen and unsung words of the church, but also have a vision for the future of the church and our own land of Scotland. I'm glad to be part of this chosen group, and I believe that there is work to be done, and I want us to get on and do it together, but always independent in God. And I have to say that we're not through the pain yet, by any means. We need to be aware of that. But the fact that there is pain does not mean that you don't press on. And you press on graciously and warmly and positively, because that's what our generation's been called to do. And that's what I would want to do, and hope you can do it with me.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you.